when you think about it, though, the original Nintendo was a social gaming platform without having things like the internet.
Yeah, it was a regular thing that people would come over and play each other's games, and family members would sit down and play games with each other. Matter of fact, playing video games for almost a decade, even when the Genesis was really, really popular, most parents would call it "Go play Nintendo."
Yeah, they did. That was like Kleenex. It was the household brand name. Even though it's facial tissue and you may not have Kleenex brand, it was still Kleenex. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that, like I mentioned with inflation, that much money was a lot back then. I don't like using this term, but if you were in the middle class back then, you had enough money to have a Nintendo generally. But not a lot of homes. Oh, I don't say not a lot. Because a lot of homes did, but...
It was such a popular thing and such a great babysitter in a lot of cases where it paid for itself to have a Nintendo in the home.
Yeah. Well, and it was like vinyl records. When you got a vinyl record, you called your friends to come over and listen to it. Mm-hmm. It's not like CDs. I mean, you buy a CD now, you listen to it in the car or in your computer or, whatever you have handy. You don't call people and say, hey, I got the CD, come over and listen to it. And some people might, but by and large, it doesn't happen that way. But back then, you got a vinyl record, you called friends over and you listened to it. And I think the same could be said for those Nintendo games. Mm-hmm. More people per system than what you have now. I mean, a lot of homes have multiple systems, not just like a PlayStation and an Xbox. Some homes have 2 Xboxes. I have 2 PlayStation 2s. I have my personal PlayStation 2, which was the slim model because I got rid of the big bulky one. Well, I didn't get rid of it, it stopped working. And then we have Sydney's big bulky one that still works. That's probably a big part of it too. We have 2 Wiis also for the same reason. She had one when I met her, and I had one when we met, so...
A lot of people just sell one off, but at the same time, there's a lot of uses in having them in multiple systems like that.
Well, the PlayStation 2 isn't worth selling, and while the Wii might be, there's a problem with the way they did the gaming downloads. Unlike Xbox and PlayStation, where you had a username tied to an email address that you could transfer to a different system, the Wii doesn't have that. It's tied to your system, and if you buy a new one, they are completely not willing to transfer the codes. They want the money for the system. They don't want you to be able to sell it. So I think part of it is greed, and I don't like that. I like being able to upgrade my system or buy the special collector's edition system for something when I want to. The only thing this does is discourage you from buying it right off, just in case there's a special edition console that comes out that you might want. Like the Red Wii, that was a really cool looking system. Or Sydney really likes Pokemon, but she doesn't want a 3DS because she expects that there will at some point eventually be a Pokemon Special Edition 3DS, because there's been one for every system prior. So she hasn't bought a 3DS because of that. So I think they're shooting themselves in the foot doing that. That's not really about the NES. So.
Tangents of point.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about offshoots like that, let's go ahead and talk about the peripherals a little bit. So you had your standard gamepad, which was the 2 face buttons, you got the D-pad, then you had the select and start, which was kind of ingenious in a way. It was so simple that everybody could get a hold of it really easy and figure it out, despite the fact that a lot of people were pretty much used to 1 or 2 buttons and a joystick. So it was actually rather complicated considering how simple it is today. Matter of fact, going back and looking at the controller now, it's amazing how small it is. I remember it being so much bigger, but then again, my hands were smaller too. So.
Yeah, I had that issue too.
Then they had stuff like the Advantage, which was basically a gigantic arcade stick. So if people wanted to kind of have an arcade experience, you could get this thing. And then you had the Stranger stuff. I think the most famous of the Stranger peripherals is, of course, the Power Glove. And if for no other reason that the fact the movie The Wizard portrayed it as the most amazing gaming device ever. I've already used the clip, so I can't use it again so soon.
You sure you could?
But yeah, it was a very awkward piece of technology because your hand, largely by what direction you moved it, was your direction pad, and everything else was still hand. Well, I guess making a fist was a button, wasn't it?
Yeah, and moving fingers, I think, acted as buttons too.
For most of the games that it actually worked with, like that ball game, I can't remember the name of it.
I have it. I think it's called Glove Ball, or Super Glove Ball.
Yeah. Now, the handy thing was they did actually basically have a whole separate other controller on top of it, so you could still use it as the basic controller.
Well, the problem with that is you wouldn't be able to use it that way if you were wearing it.
No.
And if you're not wearing a Power Glove, then what is the point of having one?
But see, that was one of the nifty things about that, is there was a lot of gear that you actually wore. And I don't know, I always pictured this whole Captain N thing of somebody completely outfitted in this Nintendo gear. For example, one of them is the Konami Laser Scope, which was a version of the NES Zapper, basically, that you wore on your head. It had this little eye scope thing that fit over your eye and basically shot from that. So you were actually shooting from where you were pointing your head. And I think you shot by talking into the microphone, the one in front of your face, which oddly enough is a technology they're still working with. And I don't remember it being particularly successful. I think more people liked actually holding the zapper in their hand than yelling into a microphone for some inaccurate shooting with your eyeball.
The funny things that you could do with these peripherals. They all look so goofy. And was it just me, or did the way the wizard portrayed the Power Glove actually make it look badass?
Oh, it did, because it looked like it was making the car go faster.
Yeah.
How do you do that? It's the Power Glove.
And they
awesome.
kind of sold it that way, too.
That it was like a gaming enhancement device.
Like you were saying with the making the car go faster, they did kind of market it like it would change the rules of the video game that you were playing.
Or enhance your own video game playing ability, because suddenly you were the game.
Yep.
Which is where the U-Force came from. The original Connect and Move and Wii. This little thing that basically looked like an enlarged version of the Battleship game. You know, those little things that pop up and you've got the two screens, one on the bottom. And, okay, it looked kind of like a gigantic DS.
Yeah, I played Battleship. How old do you think I am?
I'm talking to the audience too, you know.
Oh, okay.
I never understood quite how that worked, because we're talking technology out of the late 80s here. How accurate could this thing be? And I remember probably one of the bigger games that it was touted to work with was Punch-Out, where you would throw your hands at it in certain directions, and it would be how Little Mac would actually move on screen. Now, first of all, I can just imagine how many people accidentally punched their U-Force.
That's probably why the Wiimote came with a strap.
Probably. Oh, and then the Rollin' Rocker. Now,
I don't know about that one.
That is probably one of the more obscure ones that more people are actually familiar with. And you can almost call it like the Wii board. But it was basically one of those things, but it looked more like a toy. It was all plastic. It had kind of this bulbous underneath of it.
Oh, wow.
It kind of looks like a manhole cover.
Yeah, it does.
Or some sort of really berserk record player.
That was for Nintendo?
That was for Nintendo. And you stood on it, and you tried to play games with it. And I say tried because I don't think it worked well with almost anything. And as you can imagine, it doesn't look particularly like it would work very well.
No, it doesn't even have any buttons.
Because basically, your left and right and up and down is just what direction you're pressing on top of this board. And then you use the control pad's other buttons for the rest of it.
Well, and again, what is the point?
So you can feel like you're on an actual skateboard.
Oh.
Which is really funny because I'm seeing some of the games on this list that they've got on here. Roger Rabbit. There's a baseball
X-Men.
game. Yeah, X-Men, Karate Kid. Oh, okay, this is from LJN. That's why. That's an LJN thing. That's got to be. There's no way.
They spelled interactive wrong, too.
Because literacy is cool. That's really all I know about that. It was just one of those things that really stood out, and I remember some of the commercials.
Now, you have a Rob.
Yes.
And this is something that I'm jealous of, because I've never had one. I've never seen one used. Not even any of the times I've been over at your place. We've never taken it down and used it.
That's because it's kind of a pain to use.
Yeah.
Because you literally had to pause your game, and it would start flashing the screen when you were giving the Rob commands. And he would use these little spindle things to either press buttons on the control pad. There was this big red and blue switch thing, and you'd have him raise and lower the little spindle that he had to select which button. And if ever the game got complicated enough you needed two buttons, you would have to rotate him around to this little battery-powered box. Let him drop this spindle into it, because it's basically a top. Let this thing, like a pencil sharpener, get it revved up, then you would balance it on one of these other buttons while you went over and grabbed the other one. And doing this all in time without getting hit by enemies, specifically in Gyro Mode. I never played Stack 'em. That was a rough thing to do. So, by and large, Rob probably only got played about 2 hours of his entire existence. The rest of the time, me and my brother played two-player with it. One of us would be Rob, and the other one would play the guy. And that was actually just about as challenging because we would like to troll each other by almost squashing underneath the pipes in the doorways. And sometimes the almost weren't almosts. And that was such a satisfying little...
So what you're saying is that your Rob is practically brand new and unused.
By and large. Now, this doesn't mean that he doesn't have some wear and tear on him, because...
Of being packed away and stuff.
Packed away. And he's kind of yellowed with age.
Well, a lot of
does not do good things to white plastic.
Yeah. And a lot of Nintendo and their controllers and their peripherals had that gray color that would tend to tint like that too.
But nobody in our household were smokers, so that definitely helped in a lot of ways.
Yeah, we didn't have any smokers either. Now, they had red light zappers, but the most common color that I see is gray. I have a gray one. I didn't even know they had red ones, or, well, I guess it's not really red, it's like an orange color, yeah. Until I was at a used shop a long time ago, and I saw it, and I was like, is this imported?
No, this came in the age of where guns were getting really controversial in kids' hands. Because back in my day, and yours too, I'm not that much older than you, it was really easy to go down to your Walmart and pick up like a cap gun that looked fairly convincingly like an Uzi or a miniature M16 or some pistol or rifle or something like that. Yeah. So having a gun zapper thing that was fairly realistic wasn't completely unheard of either. And then there was the gray zapper. But there was so much controversy about kids with guns that even though there is nothing about that gray controller that looks realistic, other than what might be seen in bad light, they still turned it orange for the re-release for the later systems. And this was even before they started putting the slot at the top. It was still the spring-loaded NES.
The spring-loading NESs don't last very long.
No, I'm surprised the one I've got still works as well as it does, which is half the time.
I don't know why the pin connector is what the problem is, but it is what the problem is. Mm-hmm. Well, from what I used to be told, it was the springs in the system going bad and not holding the game in the right spot. Now, I don't know if that's what causes the wear to the pin connector, but I recently replaced a pin connector to one of the NES systems that I have, and it works like a charm now. It loads up first time every time. All I have to do is make sure the game is clean. Just wipe it out with some alcohol water mix and let it dry, put it in, make sure it's clean, and it just loads up instantly. Now, if that's the case, why would the top loading systems be more renowned for not breaking if it's wear on the connector?
But I think when you first connect the pins, that's an important part. But when the game gets slid down, pressed down into that little click, those pins from there get attached to kind of like when batteries are touching against their contacts. When it reaches that, then it contacts properly. But if there's something, whether it's dirt, whether it's the game not being held quite right, it's not going to fire off the proper amount of electricity into the right pins or something along those lines. And it's going to glitch up the game. Because usually, if there's going to be a problem, it's going to be when you first turn it on.
Yes.
That's not always the case. I have seen games go wonky in the middle of gameplay.
It's one of the few cartridge systems where bumping it will actually screw it up. Mm-hmm. The Super Nintendo didn't have that issue, and neither did the Nintendo 64. Now, you can't pick it up and shake it or anything, but you could bump it lightly and it would usually be okay.
Yeah, you couldn't do that with the early CD systems either.
Well, it's a CD.
For a completely different reason.
Oh man, I remember when they displayed the new Xbox 360 Slim, and somebody at the press conference picked up the Slim, and the guys that were showcasing it freaked out. They're like, "You don't pick up the system while it's got a game going?"
Well, that's still back in the days when even the new systems were having a lot of issues unbalancing the spinning and tearing up lasers and discs alike.
But yeah, the pin connector and then it's an NES, and for those of you out there that have one that doesn't work and you're just kind of tired of it not working, it's incredibly cheap to go on eBay and buy one of these 72-pin connectors, and it's even easier to take the thing apart and replace it. There's a little bit of finagling that you have to do because the thing is so new, it doesn't slide in as easy as the one that you pull out. And it is a connector. You're basically putting this connector onto a circuit board. It's like installing a graphics card, basically. It just is a little bit rough when you put it on the first time.
Be gentle, but be firm.
Yep. Don't be afraid of breaking it. I mean, obviously don't bend it or jam on it or bang it with a hammer to get it on there. But these circuit boards are surprisingly sturdy. So if this is something you're interested in, just go to eBay, type in NES 72-pin connector, and you can find all kinds of websites that will instruct you on how to take your NES apart and put the connector on there.
Well, if you don't mind spending the money and don't want to get your hands dirty with the technical parts, there's a lot of remanufactured NESs, basically, from several different companies. Now, I know you had one, and I don't think you were too much of a fan of it.
The problem with it is that the emulation on it isn't very good. Battletoads, for example, would freeze on the second level in the game where you're going down the hole. That level would freeze every time I got to it. And I know there are certain games it will not play.
I'm sure it would not work with Castlevania 3 because of that custom sound chip they had in it. They messed up a lot of normal NESs.
Yeah, it did not work with Castlevania 3. But there is something that's been on pretty much every Nintendo system until the Wii, and that was faceplate covers that you could pull off on the bottom for installments. And I don't know of any that really came out out in the United States for the Super Nintendo or the regular Nintendo.
Now, the Super Nintendo, we'll probably get into that. That actually did have a purpose, and it almost came into being, and Nintendo played a little mean and dirty, and the PlayStation was born out of it.
Yep.
As for the why there was one on the NES, and I'm pretty sure there is one, was because the original Famicom had a disk drive system. Matter of fact, some of the earliest games, the ones that Hudson made and Nintendo has their name all over, like all the sports titles and a couple of the others. But anyway, a lot of those games, the reason they were so tiny, I'm serious, they're like 4K for the entirety of the game. They fit on a floppy disk that went into the system. And that's where a lot of the rewrite stuff from like Mach Rider and Excitebyte came from, was because of the technology that they were using with the disk drives. And then, of course, the battery packs came later on, which I don't guess was used before Zelda.
Those batteries will eventually die, and you won't be able to save your game. You could take it apart and
Replace
put a new one in, yeah. You know, since there's no point in saying, oh, avoids the warranty. What warranty?
They aren't going to let you take that back now, no.
Yeah.
The only thing would be like if you're wanting it to have some sort of value for being original or something.
We did mention the Game Genie, and before we go off on the Game Genie, there is something about it that I would like to say. I'm a huge Mega Man fan.
No.
If it's Mega Man, I'll buy it. Okay. For the longest time, I played a copy of Mega Man 2 without Game Genie codes, but that was connected with a Game Genie, just because it was easier to get it to work on the Nintendo.
That's
and
interesting.
For whatever reason, it changed the way the music played from the very first moment that I played the game. So I didn't know that I was not listening to the original Mega Man 2 music. It was being played back in higher tones, so all of the tunes that would kind of play and then go low, when I would play them, they would go high. And so for a long time, I thought that was the Mega Man 2 music. And then I ended up with a copy that I actually owned instead of borrowed it. And it played normal because I wasn't connecting it through the Game Genie anymore. And I thought this copy of the game that I bought was broken. So I went and gave it back to the friend that I got it off of. I was like, hey man, this isn't working. He's like, what do you mean? It's like, the music is all messed up. I was like, what are you talking about? So he puts it in and he listens to it. He's like, no, that's the way it's supposed to play. I was like, no, it's not. So we had this argument about how the music was supposed to play. But the thing is that I had disconnected at some point the Game Genie from the copy that was doing that and given it back to a different friend. And I was never able to recreate that sound. So it had temporarily altered the way the game registered the sound.
Because that's the whole point of the Game Genie, is to rearrange code. But the fact that you didn't input anything for it to do that is kind of strange.
Yeah, that's the only strange thing that I have ever had happen to me out of a Game Genie.
And just to clarify for the few people who don't know, Game Genie was basically an input device that you put into your NES, and then you put your cartridge into it, and then you would use these books, you would put in these codes, and then it would alter your games in different ways, whether it would give you infinite lives, or infinite health, or infinite bullets, or give you items early, or whatever the case may have been. And it's a cheap process that has continued for a very long time. They made a Game Genie or a Game Shark for virtually every single system up into the last couple of years.
See, I don't understand how you would load something like that with a disk-based system.
Well, it basically did the same thing. You would put in a Game Shark, in this case, disk. It would read it first, and then it was basically one of those disk changer systems like what you'd get in multi-disc games.
Mm-hmm. I have only had two, but I did have one at some point for the Super Nintendo, but I don't have that anymore. But I had an NES one. I don't think I have that anymore. I do still have my original Game Boy Game Genie, and it was kind of bulky because of the way that it had to fit into the Game Boy. So it was almost the same size as the Game Boy itself. So it was a little weird.
There wasn't lockout chips back in those days. So the only thing that prevented American units to play Japanese games, for example, was the fact that there's little plastic tabs in the bottom of them. So if you just remove those tabs, you can actually play any import game you want on your standard Nintendo system. Once again, it'll void your warranty.
The thing with the Game Genie was it didn't have those tabs. So you could plug the import game into the Game Genie, and then the Game Genie won't have the tabs, so you can just plug it in your NES.
The NES Satellite was the device that allowed you to play 4-player. There wasn't a lot of games that allowed you to do this. There was a volleyball game, I think it was V-Spike. I believe the original Gauntlet, but I know Gauntlet 2. Let me see, it was Nintendo World Cup? Now, probably the most used of the more bizarre peripherals was the Power Pad. That was actually quite popular. And it was basically...
Track and field, right?
Yes, track and field.
Yeah.
That was basically just these big buttons placed down on it. Almost looked like a small twister pad. You put it on the floor and you just hit the buttons and corresponding to what the game asked you to. And most of the time it was running in place, like Street Cop, which is probably one of the worst Power Pad games ever made. But at the same time, one of the rarest games, supposedly. And then there was the Miracle Piano System, which actually showed up for the Genesis and I believe the Super Nintendo too, which was a very interesting take on bringing education stuff to a gaming system. And it was basically just a cartridge with a music program built into it to help teach the lower end points of keyboard, and it gave you this little keyboard that went along with it. They always seem to be sold out. Kind of be interesting to see if any of those chiptune rock bands use that. That's probably all the time we should give to peripherals. Since we're actually being really, really tight time, there's probably shouldn't get into too much of the extra media, but Nintendo was really popular that they merchandised about as much as they could. There was Nintendo cereals, Nintendo comic books, there was all sorts of cartoons, and of course you have to include Captain N. It may have been an awful show, but you and I both agreed at the time it was awesome.
I loved it. I watched it every morning that it was on. And I really liked it when it was Friday and we got to see the Zelda cartoon.
I didn't get to see those until many, many years later on the internet, because for whatever reason, the word is right there on my... Syndication! Okay, its syndication was very limited. NBC seemed to own half of it, and I think Fox owned the other half of it. So
I think I saw it on Fox.
That was when it was really strange that they had that crossover with the Zelda cartoon and the Captain N show. And I think they did it more than once.
Yeah, they did do it more than once, because I remember at least 2 or 3.
Now, it was made by the same animation teams, but the fact that they were syndicated to different networks, that was interesting. And of course, we've already mentioned The Wizard, which might as well have been a floor show for Super Mario 3 and little else.
Yep.
And the Power Glove. And the Super Mario Brothers movie. We'll probably get into that on a different show, so I'll save that one.
No matter how bad it is, I still liked it.
It is a classic in its own demented little way. So, back in the day when Nintendo was doing all of this, they had a firm grasp of anything that went on their system. Now, technically, most companies still use the process very similar to this. You can't just make any game you want and put it out there for somebody else's system. You usually have to have production kits or special utilities or something like that. Even with Valve, you have to have certain licensing fees. Well, in Nintendo's case, you actually had to buy a chip from them to put in your cartridge. And this went pretty well until there was some problems where there was chip shortages. And this caused a lot of companies to be very limited on what they could release, and even when they did release, even if the game was a superb hit, they could only sell so many because they could only make so many. And this is probably why a lot of games that could have sold as much as Super Mario Brothers didn't. And I'm sure that's probably something to this day or a couple of those companies. But some of them still try to get around this. Konami is probably the more famous of these, actually developed a company called Ultra, who released a lot of Konami games and other licensed games under it. A lot of people remember most of the Ninja Turtles games that they made, including the ones that was based off of the arcade game, was released under the Ultra label. Then there was the unlicensed games. These are the people that figured out tricks to get around these Nintendo blockouts with this other chip. Now, the first one to do this was Tengen. It was actually a subsidiary of Atari, where Tengen was taking largely Sega properties, if I remember right, Shinobi and Xenophobe.
They have Gauntlet and Pac-Man Tengen copies. Cartridges also.
Now, where Tengen got in trouble was Tetris, because they had released a version illegally, and then Nintendo bought the rights to actually use an official Tetris. And so when there was 2 Tetrises on the system, there were lawsuits. And of course, Tengen lost that because they did not have the licensing permission to make it from either company, actually. That was a mess.
I like the Tengen carts. I think they look kind of cool next to all of the normal gray carts. They were slanted in the front.
But the more infamous of unlicensed game companies was Color Dreams. Now, these were people that barely had any business making video games. Just about everything they made was awful in so many different ways. The only game that probably was worse was the Action 52 monstrosity. But Color Dreams failed to such an extent, it actually renamed itself into Bunch Games for a while, failed again, and decided to go into a niche market of religious-themed games under the name of Wisdom Tree, which is, of course, where we get those awful Bible adventure games and such. Now, Spiritual Warfare, for the record, despite the fact it looked awful, was a fairly decent Zelda knockoff. It's probably the only game of theirs that was actually playable.
All of the unlicensed stuff that I see in shops these days, places like Vintage Stock, or basically your local used game that will sell old Nintendo games, or a lot of the unlicensed games for Nintendo that I see are the religious titles. I don't ever see any of the other ones.
I don't think they sold nearly as well. And I have no problem with religious games, obviously, but at the same time, these were people that did it because they knew they had a market, not because they were trying to do something. And that's what annoys me about them, is they knew they had this kind of touched by an angel market of people that wanted to buy Christian-themed games for their kids without knowing anything about the company. And I think nowhere is this more evident that there was a game made by Color Dreams, and I cannot remember the name of it, that involved some rather disturbing imagery, and they basically re-edited the graphics despite the game being identical in every other way, to call it Sunday Funday and suddenly make it about a kid going to Sunday school and trying to avoid dangers on the way there. So knowing that this other game involved...
Yeah.
So the end of the Nintendo basically came with the Genesis and the Mega Drive. There was a lot of push to newer technologies that were prettier and fancier, and the NES just couldn't keep up anymore, especially since the chip shortages wasn't really carrying through, and a lot of third-party developers couldn't either afford to be making games under this license that Nintendo had. They were jumping ship and heading to the next best thing, and since the Genesis was selling so well, that's where they went. And it was pretty much because of that despite the fact that Nintendo was already developing a 16-bit platform, it kind of pushed their plans a little further ahead than I think they were intending on. Ironically, the Super Nintendo was a very strong system from day one to the end of its life cycle, and it was a very good follow-up to the NES. And it was another starting point for a lot of new gaming franchises, so it was pretty much everything that Nintendo was and built upon it.
All right, that's good.
But you have nothing to say about it, so I guess we should close out the show. Super Nintendo? What? I never played that.
I love the Super Nintendo. I remember it being in displays. You know, they always like to display games and stuff. When they first come out, but the Super Nintendo was one of those things where you had your storefront, you had your windows to your storefront in like the mall. Instead of displaying the Super Nintendo on one TV, they would have TVs stacked on top of TVs displaying the Super Nintendo, because that's how awesome it was.
And it was about the truth of it, too. Just about everybody that played it really came away from it with a wow. And I think that's largely because they weren't Genesis players. They were a lot of people that came straight out of the NES into the Super Nintendo because they were Nintendo loyalists. And even a lot of the Genesis people, the Genesis, Sega had a way of getting ahead of themselves in their technology. It had already been around for several years, and it had limitations even then. So when the new guy came along, the sound chip specifically, just all the different colors, the smoother animations in a lot of cases, the smoother controls in even more cases, and of course the sound chip being the majority of the difference, it just made it feel like the Super Nintendo was an entire generation ahead of Genesis, even though the Genesis felt like an entire generation ahead of Nintendo. The NES, that is.
It may as well have been, too.
But this is a whole other subject, and we're short on time. So that was our show for November 17th of 2012. That's number 11 for the people still counting. We're not looking up above our heads up there. And so the Wii U came out today.
Yep.
So with that big launch, I guess we're finally into the next gen of gaming. This has been the longest generation cycle we've ever had. And probably for good reason. The next generation doesn't look all that next generation.
Well, the Star Wars game was pretty impressive.
And we haven't seen what's going to be pushed out of Microsoft and Sony yet. And that's where we know the graphics are going to be. So, and the Wii U's not looking half bad. I've seen a lot of footage too, and I'm not going to say my socks are blown off.
No.
I'm still hopeful for another successful run. I hate to see Nintendo go anywhere. I don't want to see another Sega happen. So, more power to them, and definitely looking forward to that Smash Brothers.
Oh gosh. I will be playing the mess out of that.
And we'll probably have a discussion about Smash Brothers when it comes out, too, because we almost did it this time, but we decided to wait until the new one was out, or at least we knew a lot more about it than what we do currently. And thanks for joining us. We'll be back probably the Monday after next. We'll probably take this next week off, just to get ourselves recuperated after so much turkey. Oh, my goodness. Or ham.
Turkey, and mashed potatoes, and cream corn, and green beans. Oh. With sweet potatoes.
Do be careful out there on the Black Friday / Black Monday / Black Weekend / Black November and whatever other sales are going on during the course. And be careful with Steam. Save a little money for Christmas, folks.
Yes, Steam will have holiday sales. They always do.
So, I'm Chris.
I'm Mike.
We'll see you next time, guys.
Later.